Let's talk about the Passion Translation. The thing with the Passion Translation, it claims to be a heart-level Bible translation. I think that's questionable. I don't really understand what it actually means. Sure, there's this phrase that expresses God's fiery heart of love. I have argued elsewhere that the very literal ESV actually, in some places, is superior to the Passion Translation in rendering Paul's fiery heart of love for the Philippians. I think that in general, I find the Passion Translation to be a very literal translation. I also find it to be a very naive translation, and it's clearly done by someone who doesn't engage in the languages at a meaningful level. In saying that, I find it to be very literal, except where Brian Simmons has a theological axe to grind. Now, let's talk some history. The Passion Translation project started in 2002, or well, before then, when Brian Simmons published this version of the Song of Songs. Brian Simmons' translation of Song of Songs. I haven't read his translation of the Song of Songs. I'm led to believe that he takes a certain interpretation of the Song of Songs, that of the allegorical, and even here it says inside this allegory, this was a popular interpretation of the Song of Songs in the medieval period, both within Jewish and Christian commentary upon it. I wouldn't agree with it. I think that the Song of Songs is perfectly fine within the canon of Scripture as a demonstration of the acceptability of sexual love between a husband and a wife. But that's beside the point. Brian Simmons has updated Song of Songs maybe at least once to this version, as far as I'm aware, is the version that you will find in the New Testament with Psalms, Proverbs, and Song of Songs. But as I'm only just starting to learn Hebrew, I don't feel qualified to comment on his translation of the Hebrew. Now, one of the things about the Passion Translation is that it is an entirely new, fresh translation using the original Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic documents. Consulted the Masoretic text of Hebrew Bible and Aramaic text. That's pretty standard. Also the Septuagint, also standard. It's an older version of the Stuttgartensia, but it is that's more or less the standard. Nestle Aland 27th edition, also standard. The 28th edition came out in 2012, while incorporating insights from the Syriac, Aramaic, Peshitta, as well as the Roth text. Now, what's the Roth text? This, as the Syriac Peshitta, it was actually edited by John Gwynn and a few others as well. But John Gwynn was the one who finished it up. And there is no edition like the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia or the Novum Testamentum Graecae called the Roth text. What actually is the Roth text is this. It is a parallel Aramaic English New Testament. So basically it's an English translation. In some discussion with Brian Simmons on Facebook, A commentator on the use of the Syriac within the Passion Translation actually found out that he also uses this text. Now, I think that this text, which is also an English translation of the Syriac, is far more prevalent in being referenced than the Roth text, or even my green Peshitta New Testament. And I think what we find in the Passion Translation is that there is a favouring of strange renderings of the Syriac, as opposed to more mundane ones, because the Syriac is actually a very literal translation of the Greek into Syriac, done in the 2nd century. Now, the thing with your Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. So yes, it is Aramaic. It's Eastern rather than Western Aramaic, and that does make a difference. It means that it's more the Aramaic that you would find in, well, Syria, rather than the Aramaic of Palestine and Galilee specific. When linguists talk about the Aramaic of Jesus, they normally narrow it down to a Galilean dialect. And the New Testament actually makes reference to this specifically. When Peter denies Jesus, one of the questions put to him is, well, you speak Galilean, so therefore you must be one of Jesus' disciples. And so it's the wrong Aramaic for it to be Jesus' Aramaic, but it is close enough. And yes, it's closer than, say, Hebrew is. But 2nd century Aramaic translation of a Greek text, because there are just as many Semiticisms in this, because it's New Testament Greek, so it contains Semiticisms. But interestingly enough, this actually contains Hellenisms, which you wouldn't expect if the original was actually Syriac. And so you have that issue. Simmons is actually correct in saying that Hebrew and Syriac or Aramaic are heart languages, while Greek speaks primarily to the head. And I take issue with that because, first of all, it's quite clear to me that God used Greek. Greek was the lingua franca of the day, the common language, and it's a denial that God can speak to the heart through a language that supposedly speaks to the head. I believe that humans are multifaceted creatures. We engage with the world around us through both our rationality and our emotions, and that means that our languages reflect this, and it's not clear that one language or another is focused towards this or that. And in any case, as I mentioned earlier, the Greek of the New Testament is heavily Semitic rather than straight Attic Greek or literary Greek or whatever. And it's all in service to him grinding his theological axes. And the other thing that you find, and I started marking up the Passion Translation because I find it weirdly fascinating. I find it so fascinating that it does have this bias, but I actually want to understand it from the bottom up. I do find the textual choices to be incredibly inconsistent, and that to me is a huge red flag. And if I was to make the strongest argument I could against it, I would point to this inconsistency in the sources rather than, say, the theology or whatever. But when I started marking up the New Testament, I of course started with Matthew because, like any modern English translation, the canonical ordering is preserved. And what I found when I started marking up Matthew, I got to about Lord's Prayer, so chapter 6. And I started seeing references to Shem Tov. Now, one of the references also talked about how it was the Hebrew original. Now, there was a myth floating around in the early church. I think Papias talks about Matthew originally composing his gospel in Hebrew, and it was then translated into Greek, both by Mark and then Matthew himself. Now, the earliest form of the Gospel of Matthew in so-called Hebrew is what appears to be this rabbinical translation used almost completely for the service of polemics against the Christian faith by the Jewish rabbis Eben Bohan. His name is George Howard. He believes that it's probably dating from the 11th century, about. And not having studied, I've only really looked it up to look at how Simmons actually translates the Hebrew. I wouldn't agree with his translations there either. But this is part of the polemical work, and it denies the divinity of Christ in some respects. And so I think the question I then have is, why would you use it? Like, as a novelty, it's quite interesting in terms of medieval Jewish and Christian interactions, but I'm not sure that in terms of using it as a translational source, it's actually that useful or relevant. It's quite clear from the text that Howard did fish out that it is Byzantine in nature. It conforms to the shape of the New Testament that, and specifically the book of Matthew, that we have documented from the era in which we actually do believe it was written in or translated in. The use of it as a textual source, it seems to be begging the question of, well, what is the text of Scripture? But the argument for Aramaic primacy, first of all, is shaky at best, and almost no scholar outside of the Syriac Church actually holds to that position. And so the textual foundation of the Passion Translation is indeed questionable because it elevates the subsequent translations that we know are translations to equivalent status with the Greek, and it's all in service of his theology, which he wants to write into Scripture rather than read out of. And so it's an eisegetical translation rather than an exegetical one.